It's not very often on this channel that I get to talk about moments in NBA history that have ever and will ever only happen once. But that's exactly what happened in December of 2011, when a bizarre set of circumstances led to the league vetoing a trade that 3 different teams had already agreed to. And more interestingly, the players that were involved in the trade that was vetoed, as well as the trade that eventually ended up happening, has dramatic consequences for the following decade in the NBA. So let me take you back to December of 2011. The Dallas Mavericks won the title the year before, defeating the Miami Heat. The league is just coming out of a lockout in December. They're about to start the season, and the most interesting player in the league at the time was 26-year-old Chris Paul, who had requested a trade from the, at the time, New Orleans Hornets, and there were a variety of teams interested in bringing in Paul, and those teams were New York, both the LA teams, and Golden State most reportedly. There are even some reports that Golden State was willing to trade away Steph and a couple of picks to get Chris Paul. Obviously that doesn't end up happening, but the destinations here are critically important because Paul was going to be a free agent in 2013, so if you're one of these teams, it needed to be a team that was confident that they would be able to re-sign Chris Paul. And in early December, news breaks. The Los Angeles Lakers have traded for Chris Paul. The trade is agreed upon, and the trade at the time was the Lakers getting Chris Paul, the Rockets getting Pau Gasol, and the Hornets getting Lamar Odom, Luis Scola, Kevin Martin, Goran Dragic, a future first-round pick, and a future second. The idea here for each of these teams, for the Lakers, of course, they want to be the favorites once again in the Western Conference, a team that was used to having success in the prior few seasons and wasn't as good as they wanted to be in the prior season before the lockout. They end up pairing Chris Paul alongside Kobe Bryant. Andrew Bynum becomes an all-star in the 2011-12 season, and those trio of players, in addition to some championship-proven guys already on the roster, would put them in position to be one of the favorites in the Western Conference once again. The Rockets are going to bring in Pau Gasol here and get a legit all-star and cash in on some of these assets that they've been building, assets that they would ultimately trade for a different star player, which we're going to talk about later. And then for New Orleans, they're just trying to get anything they can out of Chris Paul. They're trying to avoid drama that followed, for example, the Carmelo Anthony sweepstakes in the prior trade deadline, where there's just, at this point in time in the league, there's a lot of stars getting traded, requesting trades, and New Orleans just wants to move on. They want to get value. It's clear that this isn't an outstanding trade package, especially compared to what stars typically get traded for today. But New Orleans wanted assets that they could maybe ship to another team, for example, like Lamar Odom, and they wanted guys that were legitimately good at basketball so they wouldn't be completely awful because they still wanted fans to come to the games. However, this was a Hornets franchise that at the time in New Orleans was not operating like a normal NBA team. They did not have an owner. They were having some financial issues, and the league ends up taking over the Hornets as the owner of the team, as well as the other 29 teams in the league being shareholders and essentially having voting power within the final say of whatever the Hornets want to do basketball-wise moving forward. And that leads to, an hour after the Lakers trade gets reported, the NBA itself, David Stern, says the trade is not going through and they have vetoed the trade. It's important to understand here the distinction. The NBA itself, as an entity, does not veto trades. If 2 teams agree to a trade, that's what the trade is. The only reason in this circumstance the NBA was allowed to and ultimately did veto the Chris Paul to the Lakers trade is because they were technically the owners of the Hornets. So the GM at the time of the Hornets, Dell Demps, agreed to this trade with these other 2 teams and then went to ownership, in this case David Stern, and David Stern said no. Now, that's not the entire story, because as I mentioned, there's other owners involved here. The other teams in the league have input on this, and multiple of them were very, very vocal. Dan Gilbert in Cleveland, Mark Cuban in Dallas. They were vocal about the fact that this was not enough to get in exchange for Chris Paul, and that they were basically giving Chris Paul to a team in the Lakers that was going to build a semi-super team now around Kobe Bryant, Chris Paul, and Andrew Bynum. They were very upset about this. They felt like it unbalanced the league in a really dramatic way, as well as allowed the Lakers to gain a lot of cap space here and potentially add another guy as a big-time free agent or in another trade down the road as well. The owners didn't like it. They voiced those concerns to David Stern, and ultimately he vetoes the trade. It doesn't exist anymore. Now, a week later, Chris Paul does get traded to LA, but of course this time it is the Clippers. And that trade is the Clippers getting Chris Paul in a 2nd-round pick, and the Hornets getting Eric Gordon, Chris Kaman, Alfred Gamuno, and a 2012 first-round pick. Now, obviously, again, the return here is not fantastic by today's standards of stars. There would be picks and pick swaps and more players, more young players involved in this trade by today's standards. But this one, on paper and compared to the Lakers one, certainly was a better deal for a rebuilding team in New Orleans. The first one felt like Dell Demps trying to save his job, put a competent basketball team on the floor, whereas this one felt more like, okay, we're going to get some actual young players and some assets. Eric Gordon was good despite injury issues and was very good for the Clippers the year before. Aminu was a guy that was recently drafted, had upside. Kaman was at least usable, potentially an asset to a different team, and then the 1st-round pick as well. In the long term, neither of these deals would have worked out incredibly well for New Orleans, and this deal specifically specifically went about as bad as you could have possibly thought that it would. Gordon was hurt almost all the time, never wanted to be in New Orleans, tried to get out multiple different occasions, tried to sign an offer sheet with Phoenix that was matched, ultimately ends up getting traded to Houston, and of course is healthy in Houston and has a really good career and is still now in the league, but does nothing for New Orleans. Chris Kaman leaves after 1 year. Aminu is a bust and never does anything. They don't get any value out of him, and that 2012 first round pick becomes Austin Rivers, who's not very consequential to the long-term impact of the Hornets/Pelicans franchise. And so it's interesting that the NBA, in this case the owners of the Hornets at the time, vetoed a trade because a lot of other teams around the league felt like they weren't getting enough value, as well as the Lakers were becoming this great super team. And pretty much everybody failed. Like, either trade package that the Hornets would have taken, whether it be the Lakers or the Clippers, had this trade not been vetoed, did not really work out well for them at all. It would not have helped them very much in the long term at all. And the Lakers, as we now know, the following season version of the Lakers without Chris Paul was also a disaster. And as we're going to talk about later, I think you could have argued even still would have been a disaster had they made the Paul trade. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. We're going to talk about the 2012 offseason in a second. Let's go ahead and wrap up the Lakers part of this for the 2011 veto trade, right? So the Lakers end up trading Lamar Odom a few days after the veto trade. They get a first round pick out of that, him going to Dallas. Andrew Bynum develops into an all-star caliber player alongside Powell and Kobe. They end up as the third seed in the Western Conference, ultimately lose in the second round. A successful season, but one that could have been much better had they acquired Paul in the first place. Which brings us to what I think is the most interesting part of this veto trade fiasco, and that is the 2012 offseason. Because every team we've talked about to this point is going to have a couple of massive moves in this particular offseason that may or may not have happened, and certainly wouldn't have happened in the same way had that initial Lakers trade not been vetoed. So in the summer of 2012, the Lakers famously try and build this super team that ends up being a complete disaster, as I referenced earlier. They bring in Steve Nash, who has back injuries the entirety of the time that he's with the Lakers, and they bring in Dwight Howard, which ends the Dwight Howard-Dwight Mayer saga and ultimately creates one of the most complicated, most convoluted trades that we've ever seen in the history of the league, where Andrew Bynum goes to Philly, Andre Iguodala goes to Denver, Dwight Howard ends up with the Lakers. There's so many pieces flying here, and ultimately those two moves were a disaster and was like the end of whatever dynasty the Lakers were trying to create at the time. And that really only happens, at least part of it, because the Paul trade got vetoed. Like, you certainly wouldn't be trading for Steve Nash and giving away multiple first round picks to get Steve Nash had you already had Chris Paul on the roster. They might have still made the Bynum trade, but I think honestly either way that goes, it goes pretty negatively for the Lakers. Let's just say that they don't make the Howard trade. They're scared off by it. Maybe they had a really good year the year before. They finish as the 1 seed in the West because they make the Paul trade. Kobe's there, Bynum. Those three guys play really well together. They keep Bynum. That 11-12 season, when Bynum becomes an all-star, is his last good season as an NBA player. Injuries are an issue. He completely falls apart as a player and just is irrelevant for the rest of his career in the NBA. So if they don't make the Howard trade, they're a disaster. And then if they do make the Howard trade, they would have been more successful than they were with those Nash teams, assuming that Chris Paul was healthy. But that year and that season was so strange overall that I can't really give them the benefit of the doubt and all of a sudden say that they were going to be this great team when they barely made the playoffs despite the talent that they had, even if you are replacing Steve Nash's non-existent presence on that team with Chris Paul. So even if they make the Howard trade, there's no guarantee that that creates a successful team, which I think a lot of Lakers fans would probably argue against. But here's the big piece of this to me. Think back to the vetoed trade. It wasn't just the Lakers. It wasn't just the Hornets. Who was the other team involved there? The other team involved was Houston. You might not think it was a very big deal in terms of the pieces that they traded away. However, there's one name in there that's critically important. Kevin Martin is initially in that deal. He would have been sent to New Orleans had the Hornets had a normal ownership situation, had the league not vetoed the trade. Kevin Martin would have ended up in New Orleans. Kevin Martin is a critical piece of an October 2012 trade that changes the league forever, and that is Oklahoma City trading James Harden to Houston in exchange for Kevin Martin, Jeremy Lamb, and some draft compensation that ultimately becomes Steven Adams and Mitch McGary. I'm not trying to say that Kevin Martin would have been the holdup in the James Harden trade. However, I think one of the reasons that Oklahoma City ended up trading Harden to Houston, amongst financial reasons, amongst a lot of different things, I think they liked the trade in general. Draft compensation, a young player in Jeremy Lamb, and someone in Kevin Martin that they felt like from a scoring and playmaking perspective would have replaced what James Harden provided that team and give them some more assets moving forward. Ultimately, they were wrong, but without Kevin Martin there, I'm not sure that Harden ends up in Houston. I'm not sure that Oklahoma City trades him in the first place, and I don't know what that means for the future of the league moving forward. Are Russ and KD and Harden the greatest trio the league's ever seen? Did they end up winning 5 titles together because Harden ends up sticking around and they decide to pay him anyway? Was the only reason they traded him away because they liked the trade to Houston? Would that trade not have happened without Kevin Martin? Would they still have been able to find a way to make it happen even without Kevin Martin? Or would there have been another team that would have traded for James Harden and gotten a future MVP caliber player in one of the greatest trades that the league has ever seen? That to me is the legacy and the biggest question mark by far of this veto trade. The Lakers stuff is interesting because the 2011-12 Lakers post-lockout would have been better with Chris Paul, and depending on what happens with Howard and Bynum in the following season, there's certainly an argument to be made that the Lakers would have had more success in that time period than they did following the failed super team with Steve Nash and Dwight Howard. However, if you're taking Kevin Martin out of the equation in Houston, again, I think he was a pretty critical piece of this for Oklahoma City. Maybe the Harden trade, the first one, never happens. However, as we all know, the way it worked out is Chris Paul ends up a Clipper. They never make the conference finals, but they build something competent there around him and Blake and had some really good teams there, some untimely injuries. And ultimately, that sets the foundation for the Clippers to get themselves out of the basement of the NBA. And without the Paul trade, and then obviously Blake becoming who he became, it would not have been even remotely close to a successful era for the Clippers. Even with Eric Gordon and Blake there, they didn't give up a ton. They got a fantastic player in exchange. And even though the playoff success wasn't there, I don't think the Clippers are the Clippers now that have been a competent franchise for a while now without this initial Chris Paul trade, which again wouldn't have happened without this one of one, never going to happen again moment, the NBA actually vetoing a trade.